A werewolf shifter romance for you. Prologue. The iron was white hot, humming with a heat that turned the air in the great hall into a suffocating shroud. I sat strapped to the stone of judgment, my arms bound by silver-laced chains that hissed against my skin. Surrounding me were the pillars of the pack, the council elders I had looked up to since my first shift. And at the head of them stood the man who gave me life. My father. Alpha Silas. You should have looked the other way, Kaelen, he whispered, leaning down so only I could smell the rot of betrayal on his breath. You were meant to be my successor, my golden hawk. Why did you have to go into the black cellars? Why did you have to count the omegas? I couldn't answer. My jaw was clamped shut by two enforcers, their claws digging into my cheeks. But my eyes spoke for me. They screamed traitor. They screamed coward. I had seen the ledgers. I had seen the silver my father took from the human hunters in exchange for the weak members of our own blood. The law says a prince cannot be executed without a trial by the full moon, the High Elder announced, his voice trembling. But a prince who cannot speak, cannot testify. My father reached into the brazier. He pulled out the branding iron, its tip glowing like a dying star. You always had too much to say about honor, my son, Silas said. His face was a mask of cold stone, but I saw the flicker of fear in his pupils. He wasn't punishing me. He was erasing the evidence. Consider this a mercy. I am letting you live. I am simply making sure the truth stays where it belongs, buried. The enforcers forced my mouth open. I didn't scream. Even as the searing heat neared my face, even as the smell of my own flesh beginning to blister filled my nostrils, I kept my eyes locked on his. I wanted my face to be the last thing he saw every time he closed his eyes. Then came the pain. It wasn't just a burn. It was an extinction. It felt like a molten river was being poured down my throat, dissolving my words, my songs, my pleas, and my future. The world turned into a red haze of agony. My wolf howled inside my mind, a long, agonizing shriek that no one else could hear. When they were done, they unchained my slumped, shivering body. I tasted copper and ash. I tried to gasp, to curse him, to tell him I would kill him, but all that came out was a wet, pathetic puff of air. Throw the mute into the dead drop, Silas commanded, turning his back on me as if I were a broken chair. If the fall doesn't kill him, the scavengers will. He is no longer a prince. He is a ghost. They dragged me to the edge of the ravine, the jagged, mile-deep scar in the earth where the pack threw its trash and its dead. As the enforcers heaved me over the precipice, I didn't reach for the ledge. I fell into the darkness, the wind whistling through the new, jagged hole in my soul. They thought they had silenced me. They thought they had taken my power. But as I hit the first branch, then the second, shattering my ribs and painting the rocks with my blood, a new realization took hold in the silence. Lies require words. Truth only requires a blade. My father gave me a gift that day. He took away my ability to lie, to boast, and to beg. He left me with nothing but the hunt, and the hunt is always silent. If you're still shaking from that opening, you're in the right place. Welcome back to the channel. We don't just tell stories here. We give a voice to the ones the world tried to silence. If you're new to the pack, hit that subscribe button and join the silent guard. We're building something here that the high alphas are afraid of. Smash the like button if you believe that actions speak louder than words. The prince is dead. The shadow is waking up. Let's head into the full story. Chapter 1. 3 months. In the world above, 3 months is a season. In the dead drop, it is an eternity of damp stone, the smell of rotting pine, and the constant gnawing ache of a hunger that never sleeps. I didn't die when they threw me over the ledge. The mountain didn't want my soul, and the crows weren't patient enough to wait for me to stop breathing. I woke up at the bottom of the ravine with a shattered leg, 3 broken ribs, and a throat that felt like it had been filled with broken glass and set on fire. Now I crouch in the shadows of a limestone shelf, 50 feet above the canyon floor. I am no longer the golden prince in silk-lined leathers. My skin is caked in gray mud to mask my scent. My clothes are rags held together by dried sinew. I can't howl. I can't snarl. I can't even hiss. But I can listen. Without my voice, my other senses have become predatory. I hear the heartbeat of a field mouse 30 yards away. I hear the microscopic shift of a pebble under the paw of a mountain cat. The world is a symphony of vibrations, and I am the conductor. Below me, a rogue buck, scarred and exiled from his own herd, noses at a patch of lichen. He is cautious, his ears twitching. He thinks he's safe because he hasn't heard a single twig snap. He's wrong. Silence isn't the absence of a predator. It is the presence of a master. I don't use a bow. I don't have a spear. I have a jagged piece of obsidian I lashed to a bone handle, and I have the raw, desperate strength of a wolf who has been stripped of everything but his rage. I move. I don't jump. I flow. I drop from the ledge, descending through the mist like a ghost. I don't make a sound when I land on the buck's back. He lunges terrified, but my weight is already locked. I don't growl in his ear. I don't give him the mercy of a warning. I simply drive the obsidian blade into the base of his skull. The buck collapses. The only sound in the canyon is the heavy thud of his body hitting the silt and the shallow, raspy whistle of the air moving through my ruined throat. I stand over the kill, my hands stained red. My throat thrums, a low, deep vibration in my chest. It's not a vocalization, it's a physical manifestation of my wolf's power. Thorne called it the primal hum. It's the language of the earth, of the bone, and of the blood. I reach up and touch the scar on my neck. It's a jagged, silver-white canyon of its own, a map of my father's betrayal. Every time it stings, it reminds me of the names I can no longer speak. Silas, Kaelen, Prince. Those names are dead. I am the silence in the trees. I am the shadow in the ravine. And I am learning that when you stop talking, you start seeing everything. I see the rot in the roots of the great pack above. I see the way the wind carries the scent of more outcasts being tossed into this pit. I wasn't thrown here to die. I was thrown here to harvest an army. I begin to skin the buck, my movements efficient and cold. Suddenly the wind shifts. A new scent hits me. Not a deer, not a cat. Wolf. But it's not the clean, arrogant scent of an enforcer. It's the smell of copper, infection, and absolute terror. Someone else just survived the fall. I grip my knife and melt back into the shadows. The hunt for food is over. The hunt for loyalty is beginning. The scent led me to the Weeping Wall, a section of the ravine where the waterfall turns the rocks into a slick, mossy death trap. There, crumpled against a jagged spur of granite, was the body. He was a beta. I could tell by the breadth of his shoulders and the thickness of his coat, even matted with blood as it was. His legs were twisted at angles that made my own healed fractures throb in sympathy. He had been thrown from the highest point, the judgment leap, reserved for those who dared to defy the Alpha's inner circle. I approached with the silence of a mountain mist. My obsidian knife was held low. Ready to end a life or defend one, the wolf shifted. A low, agonizing whine vibrated through his ribcage. He wasn't dead, but the crows were already circling, their black eyes fixed on his exposed throat. He transitioned back to human form, a man in his mid-30s, his face a mask of dirt and agony. Coda. I recognized him. He had been the lead scout for the northern border, a man known for his unwavering loyalty to the old ways of the pack. Clearly Silas's new ways didn't include men with consciences. Coda's eyes fluttered open. They were clouded with pain, but when he saw me standing over him, a mud-caked wraith with a scarred throat and a predator's gaze, he didn't scream. He didn't have the breath for it. "Finish it," he wheezed, his fingers clawing weakly at the wet silt. Better a ghost than a slave. I didn't move. I looked at him, my head tilted. In the pack above, an alpha would have given a speech about duty or mercy. I had no words to give. I reached down and grabbed him by the front of his shredded tunic. I pulled him up until his face was inches from mine. I let him see the jagged silver brand on my neck. I let him see the prince he thought was dead. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. His eyes widened, his pupils dilating. Prince. Kaelen? I didn't nod. I didn't shake my head. I simply tightened my grip on his tunic and pointed toward the cave entrance behind the waterfall. My sanctuary. Then, I pointed to the jagged peaks far above us, where the lights of the great hall flickered like mocking stars. Follow me or die here. I didn't have to say it. The intention radiated off me in waves of primal hum. Koda looked at the cliffs, then back at me. He saw the obsidian knife, the mud-caked skin, and the terrifying cold clarity in my eyes. He realized that the prince hadn't just survived, he had evolved. With a grunt of sheer willpower, Koda reached out and gripped my forearm. His hand was trembling, but his hold was firm. It wasn't the grip of a drowning man. It was the grip of a soldier swearing an oath. I slung his arm over my shoulder. The weight was immense, and my own cracked ribs screamed in protest, but I didn't make a sound. We moved through the freezing spray of the waterfall, disappearing into the dark heart of the mountain. Inside the cave, I laid him on a bed of dry fern. I brought him water in a hollowed gourd and pressed raw medicinal moss into his wounds. Koda watched me, his breath hitching. Why? Why save a broken tool? I stood over him, the shadows of the cave making me look larger than life. I didn't speak, but I reached out and placed my hand over his heart. I felt the steady rhythmic beat. Then, I pointed to my own throat, and then to the mouth of the cave. I didn't need a tongue to tell him the truth. Silas wanted us to be trash. He wanted us to be the broken tools of the dead drop. But a broken tool can be reforged into a weapon. That night, as the wind howled through the ravine, Koda didn't sleep. He watched me sharpen my obsidian blade in the firelight. He saw the way I moved, not like a man, but like the mountain itself. By morning, I was no longer a lone monster. I was an alpha, and Koda was the first stone in the wall I was building to crush my father's world. Chapter 2. 3 years in the dark will change a man. 3 years in the silence will turn a wolf into a god. The dead drop is no longer a place of despair. It is the heart of the quiet death. I stand on a jagged limestone pillar looking down at the canyon floor. Below me, 40 wolves move in perfect, terrifying unison. There are no barks, no howls, no shouted commands. There is only the rhythmic thud of paws on packed earth, and the whistle of wooden practice blades cutting through the mist. They are the broken. Mina, whose eyes were put out by a rival alpha, now fights by sound alone, her ears twitching at the flight of a moth. Hark, whose hind leg was snapped in a trap, has learned to use a spear as a third limb, strike with the force of a falling tree. And Koda, my first follower, now my second in command, his scars a map of the loyalty he pledged in the mud. I don't give speeches. I don't lead with a roar. I close my eyes and let the primal hum vibrate in my chest. It's a low-frequency thrum that ripples through the damp air, hitting their marrow. Shift. On my command, the 40 humans vanish. In their place, 40 wolves, gray, black, and brindled, land silently in the dust. They don't snarl. They wait, their eyes fixed on me, glowing like embers in the twilight of the ravine. I drop from my pillar, landing in a crouch. I am larger than I was 3 years ago. My muscles are cords of iron, and my skin is a tapestry of scars and charcoal war paint. I reach into the leather sheath at my hip and pull out a twin-bladed dagger forged from the wreckage of a hunter's wagon. I point to the canyon wall, the path leading up to the world that discarded us. Clack, clack. I click 2 stones together. It's our code. 1 click for stealth, 2 for the hunt, 3 for the kill. We move. We don't run like a traditional pack, shoulder to shoulder and loud. We spread out, becoming shadows in the brush. I lead them through the whispering thorns, a shortcut I discovered that leads to the supply routes of the Silverstone pack, my father's pack. I can smell the high-born wolves before I see them. They smell of lavender soap, cooked meat, and the sickeningly sweet scent of unearned safety. They think the dead drop is a dumping ground. They don't realize it's an armory. I raise my hand, and 40 shadows stop instantly. Not a single leaf rustles. Not a single breath is audible. A supply caravan is approaching, guarded by 6 of Silas's elite enforcers. They are laughing, talking about the scraps they're bringing back from the southern trade. They have no idea that the mute prince they left for dead is watching them from 10 feet away, his fingers tight on a blade that's been waiting 3 years for a taste of royal blood. I don't feel anger. I feel the cold, heavy weight of justice. I look at Coda. I tap my throat, then point to the guards. Leave no breath behind. The caravan was a rolling insult. 3 heavy wagons pulled by draft horses that were better fed than the Omegas I'd left behind. The 6 enforcers guarding them were draped in silver-threaded cloaks, their swords polished to a mirror shine. They weren't warriors. They were ornaments. I raised 3 fingers, 3 clicks, the signal for the kill. I didn't howl. I didn't roar. I simply stepped out from behind a cedar tree directly in the path of the lead horse. The guard in the front, a man named Bran who used to mock me in the training pits, pulled his reins. "What a scavenger? Hey, get out of the road, you mute rat." He didn't recognize me. To him, I was just a ghost in gray mud and rags. He reached for his whip, a smirk playing on his lips. He never finished the movement. Mina dropped from the canopy like a mountain lion, her daggers finding the gaps in his gorget before he could even gasp. At the same moment, the rest of the quiet death erupted from the tall grass. It wasn't a fight. It was an extraction. The enforcers tried to shift, but my wolves were already on them. We didn't fight with honor. We fought with the desperation of the dead drop. We went for the hamstrings, the throats, the eyes. In less than 60 seconds, the clearing was silent again, save for the panicked breathing of the horses and the wet gurgle of the dying. I walked toward the lead wagon. The driver was cowering under the seat, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended rank. I didn't kill him. I needed a messenger. I reached into the wagon's lockbox and pulled out a heavy ingot of black iron, the same cold, unforgiving metal Silas used for the branding irons. It felt heavy in my hand, a physical echo of the heat that had ruined my life. I pulled out my obsidian dagger. With the precision of a jeweler, I began to carve into the iron. The screech of stone against metal was the only voice I had left, and it sounded like a funeral bell. I carved a single, jagged X across the surface of the ingot, the exact shape of the scar on my throat. I grabbed the driver by the collar and shoved the heavy iron into his chest. I didn't make a sound, but I leaned in close, letting him see my eyes. The silver-blue eyes of the prince who was supposed to be bones at the bottom of a ravine. I pointed toward the palace. "Go." The driver didn't wait. He scrambled onto the horse's back, leaving the wagons and his fallen comrades behind, and rode toward the city as if the devil himself were at his heels. Coda stepped up beside me, his fur stained red, his chest heaving. He looked at the wagons filled with grain, salted meat, and warm blankets. He looked at the quiet death, who were already systematically unloading the supplies to carry them back to the ravine. "He'll know now," Coda whispered, his voice the only sound in the woods. "He'll know the grave is empty." I looked at the X on the ground where the driver had dropped his sword. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel relief. I felt the first spark of a fire that was going to burn my father's world to the ground. We didn't take the silver. We didn't take the jewelry. We took the food for the hungry and the blankets for the cold. We left the bodies of the enforcers where they lay, their silver cloaks dragged in the dirt. By the time the sun began to set, the clearing was empty. The quiet death had vanished back into the mist of the dead drop, leaving nothing behind but a lingering scent of ozone and the realization that the silence was no longer a sign of peace. It was a declaration of war. Chapter 3. The scent hit me before the sound did. It wasn't the smell of a supply wagon or a common trade caravan. It was the scent of star lily and ozone, the unmistakable mark of high-born Luna blood. We were perched on the Devil's Rib, a jagged limestone ridge overlooking the main pass to the Silverstone capital. Below us, an armored carriage, reinforced with silver-plated iron, moved under a heavy escort of 12 sun guards. They weren't Silas's men. These were mercenaries from the southern coast. This wasn't a trade, this was a delivery. One click. My ghost pack froze. Coda crept up beside me, his nose wrinkling. "That's Lady Alara of the North," he whispered. "Word reached the valleys that Silas brokered a deal. She's being forced to marry your brother Jace to seal the alliance. They're trading her for a mountain of sulfur and gold." I felt a surge of cold fury. My brother, the golden son who watched my tongue be burned out without blinking, was now buying a wife with blood money. I looked at the carriage. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a cage. I could see the heavy iron bars through the small shuttered windows. 2 clicks. The hunt was on. We didn't strike with the blunt force of a wolf pack. We struck like a shadow cloak being pulled over a candle. Mina and her scouts took out the outriders with silent blow darts coated in hemlock. By the time the lead mercenary realized the woods had gone quiet, I was already on the roof of the carriage. I dropped through the driver's seat, my obsidian blade ending the man's shout before it could leave his teeth. The carriage lurched, the horses rearing in terror, and skidded to a halt against a mossy embankment. The mercenaries scrambled, drawing their steel, but the quiet death was already among them. My wolves fought in a haunting, rhythmic silence, just the sound of breathing, the clash of metal, and the occasional snap of bone. I stepped toward the carriage door. My heart was thumping a strange, irregular rhythm against my ribs. The air around the carriage felt charged. Static electricity danced along my scarred skin. I ripped the heavy iron door off its hinges with a surge of alpha strength. Inside she sat. Alara. She wasn't weeping. She wasn't cowering. She was huddled in the corner, a shard of broken glass held in her trembling hand, her eyes blazing with a defiance that matched my own. Her dress was torn, her silver hair matted, but she looked like a queen even in a cage. She looked at me, the mud-caked, scarred beast standing in the doorway, and her breath hitched. The shard of glass fell from her hand. Suddenly, the world didn't just go quiet. It disappeared. A golden light, invisible to anyone else, flared between us. The mate bond slammed into me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. It was a roar of color in a world I had turned to gray. It was a voice in a mind I had kept silent for 3 years. Mine. The word echoed through my skull, loud enough to make me wince. It wasn't my voice. It was the primal hum of the universe itself. Alara's eyes went wide, her pupils dilated, and the scent of star lily intensified until it was all I could breathe. She stared at the silver-white X on my throat, then back at my eyes. "You," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the chaos. "I felt you in the dark. I thought I was going mad. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I was a man who had sworn off the world, a man who had built a wall of silence around his heart. And here she was, the one person meant to tear it down. Behind me, Coda shouted a warning. A mercenary was lunging at my back with a silver spear. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. The bond surged through me, granting me a terrifying, heightened clarity. I caught the spear's shaft without looking, snapped the wood like a toothpick, and sent the man flying into the brush with a single backhand. I turned back to Alara. She was reaching out her hand, her fingers trembling as they neared the scar on my neck. I flinched back. I wasn't a prince anymore. I wasn't a husband. I was a monster made of mud and vengeance. I pointed to the woods, then to the dead drop. I didn't want her. I didn't want this bond. But as she looked at me with a mix of terror and recognition, I knew the silence had been shattered forever. I reached in, grabbed her by the waist, and pulled her out of the cage. She was no longer a captive of Silas. She was now a guest of the ghost pack, and God help the man who tried to take her back. The cave was quiet, save for the steady drip of the waterfall and the crackle of the small fire I'd built in the center of the chamber. Outside, the ghost pack kept watch, their presence a comforting weight in the darkness. Alara sat across from me on a pile of furs, her silver hair catching the amber glow of the flames. She had washed the dirt from her face, revealing a beauty that felt like a sharp blade against my chest. She was watching me, not with fear, but with an intense, searching curiosity. The guards called you the shadow of the ravine, she said, her voice soft, echoing off the stone walls. They said you were a mindless beast that lived in the mud. But I saw your eyes back there. I saw the way you looked at the silver stone crest on the carriage. You didn't just want the supplies, you wanted blood. I didn't answer. I stayed in the shadows, sharpening my obsidian dagger with rhythmic, steady strokes. Scree, scree, scree. Why won't you speak to me? She asked, stepping closer. The scent of star lily grew stronger, a sweet ache in my lungs. The bond, it's screaming. I can feel your rage. I can feel your hunger, but I can't hear your voice. I stopped sharpening. I looked up, the firelight dancing in my silver blue eyes. I reached up and pulled back the collar of my tattered tunic, exposing the jagged silver-white X that branded my throat. Ilara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She moved toward me, her footsteps light on the stone. I tried to pull away, to retreat back into the safety of the dark, but she was faster. Her fingers, cool and soft, brushed against the scarred tissue of my neck. A jolt of electricity surged through me. My wolf lunged forward in my mind, pressing against the cage of my ribs. They did this to you, she whispered, her eyes filling with a sudden, fierce tears. Silas. He didn't just exile you. He silenced you. I grabbed her wrist. Not to hurt her, but to stop the touch. It was too much. I had spent 3 years becoming a stone, and her touch was making me feel like a man again. I looked her in the eye and triggered the primal hum. I didn't make a sound, but I projected the memory into the bond, the heat of the iron, the smell of the great hall, the cold, dead eyes of my father. I let her feel the moment the words died in my throat. Ilara stiffened, her eyes glazing over as she saw what I saw. She felt the agony, the betrayal, and the long, cold nights in the dead drop. When I let her go, she was trembling, but she didn't back away. She reached out again, but this time, she didn't touch my scar. She placed her hand over my heart. I don't need you to speak, Kaelen, she said, using my name for the first time. The sound of it felt like a ghost returning to life. I can hear you. Every beat. Every scar. You think you're a monster, but you're a king who was betrayed by his own blood. She leaned in, pressing her forehead against mine. Through the bond, a new sensation flowed. Not rage, but understanding. It was a bridge built of silence. I realized then that she wasn't just my mate. She was my translator. She was the only person who could hear the music in my stillness. I didn't pull away this time. I closed my eyes and let the hum of our combined souls fill the cave. Suddenly, a low, urgent whistle echoed from the cave entrance. Coda. I broke the connection and stood up, my hand flying to my blade. Coda stepped into the light, his expression grim. The Silverstone scouts have found the carriage, Alpha, Coda whispered. Silas has sent the Iron Hounds, the trackers who never lose a scent. They're heading for the ravine, and they're not just looking for the grain. I looked at Ilara. She was the prize Silas couldn't afford to lose, and I was the secret he was desperate to kill. I didn't need words to tell the ghost pack what to do. I stepped to the cave mouth and let the primal hum vibrate through the entire mountain. Prepare. The silence is over. Tonight, we hunt the hunters. Chapter 4. The Labyrinth of Echoes is a place where the mountain breathes. It's a network of jagged obsidian tunnels where the wind whistles in a way that mimics human screams. To the uninitiated, it's a madness-inducing maze. To the quiet death, it's our backyard. I stood at the mouth of the primary rift, my skin painted with the black soot of the cave walls. Beside me, Ilara had shed her silk gown for a suit of boiled leather and a pair of serrated bone daggers. She didn't look like a captive Luna anymore. She looked like a predator. They're close, and she whispered. Through our bond, I felt her pulse, a steady rhythmic drum of adrenaline. 10 of them, the Iron Hounds. I can smell their silver-tipped arrows. I didn't nod. I simply tapped the wall of the cave. One click. The Iron Hounds entered the rift, their torches casting long, flickering shadows. They were led by Vane, a tracker who had served my father for 20 years. He was a man who prided himself on finding anything that bled. Spread out, Vane's voice echoed, bouncing off the obsidian walls 1,000 times. The girl can't have gone far, and keep your eyes peeled for that thing. The shadow. I watched them from a ledge 20 feet above. They were walking into the throat, a section of the tunnel where the acoustics are so warped that a sound made in front of you sounds like it's coming from behind. I triggered the primal hum. The vibration traveled through the floor, hitting the hound's feet. They stumbled, their inner ears reeling from the frequency. What was that? One of the trackers hissed, spinning around. Did you hear that? Suddenly, a stone shifted behind them. Mina and Coda were moving through the higher vents, dropping pebbles to lure the hounds deeper into the maze. One tracker broke away from the group, following a sound that didn't exist. He turned a corner and found himself face to face with Alara. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. As the tracker raised his crossbow, Alara lunged. She moved with a grace that surprised even me. She didn't try to outpower him. She used his own momentum. She ducked under his bolt, spun, and drove her bone dagger into the soft meat beneath his jaw. The tracker let out a wet wheeze. Alara caught his body before it hit the ground, lowering him silently into the dark. She looked up at me on the ledge, her eyes glowing with a fierce lunar silver. I felt a surge of pride through the bond, a warmth that had no business being in a place this cold. She wasn't just a mate to be protected. She was a partner to be feared. I dropped from the ledge, landing behind Vane. The lead tracker froze. He didn't hear me land, but he felt the sudden drop in temperature. He turned slowly, his torch trembling. When the light hit my face, the mud, the scars, the X on my throat, his jaw dropped. Kaelen, he breathed. It really is you. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. I didn't need a tongue to tell him his time was up. I lunged. Vane drew his silver blade, but he was fighting a man who had been forged in the dead drop. I disarmed him in 2 moves, my obsidian knife flashing in the torchlight. I didn't kill him instantly. I wanted him to see the trash he had helped discard. I leaned in, my face inches from his. I let the primal hum vibrate against his very bones, a soundless scream of 3 years of isolation and agony. Vane's eyes rolled back in his head. He wasn't dead, but his mind was shattered. The rest of the Iron Hounds were gone, dismantled by the ghost pack in the shadows. The labyrinth had done its work. I looked at Alara, who was wiping the blood from her daggers. The untamed mate was no longer a title. It was a reality. They'll send more, she said, her voice steady. Silas won't stop until this mountain is a tomb. I reached out and took her hand. I didn't speak, but I projected a single image into her mind. The palace, the festival of lies, the moment of reckoning. The hounds were just the beginning. It was time to stop hiding in the dirt and start climbing the walls. The Silverstone capital was a fever dream of gold leaf, silk banners, and the smell of roasting boar. It was the festival of the 10-year peace, a lie crafted by Silas to distract the pack from the empty chairs at their tables and the children missing from their nurseries. From the high rafters of the great cathedral overlooking the main plaza, I watched the nobles dance. They looked like bright, fluttering insects, oblivious to the spider in their midst. Beside me, Alara was draped in a stolen hooded cloak of silver gray. Her eyes were fixed on the royal dais, where my brother Jace sat preening, drinking wine from a chalice that probably cost more than a year's worth of grain for a border village. Look at them, Alara whispered, her hand finding mine in the dark. Through the bond I felt her disgust, a cold, sharp spike. They're celebrating a peace built on the backs of the trash they threw into your ravine. I squeezed her hand. I didn't need a voice to tell her that the music was about to stop. Below us, the quiet death had already moved into position. They weren't in the rafters. They were the ones carrying the trays. They were the ones scrubbing the floors. They were the invisible people, the Omegas and the discarded who Silas assumed were too broken to be a threat. Coda was disguised as a keg hauler, leaning against a pillar near the main barracks. Mina was a shadow behind the silk curtains of the banquet hall. The plan was surgical. No howling, no grand entrance, just the systematic removal of the pillars holding up Silas's throne. Suddenly, the trumpets blared. My father, Alpha Silas, stepped onto the balcony. He looked older, his hair a brittle white, but his eyes were still the same. Two cold, calculating stones that saw people as currency. "Citizens!" Silas's voice boomed, magically amplified to reach every corner of the city. "Tonight we celebrate 10 years of strength, 10 years of a pack purged of weakness. Tomorrow my son Jace will wed Lady Alara, uniting the North and South into an empire that will never fall." The crowd cheered, a mindless, practiced roar. I looked at Alara. Her jaw was set, her hand gripping the hilt of her bone dagger. "Now?" her mind asked through the bond. I didn't answer with a nod. I reached into my belt and pulled out a small, hollowed-out iron sphere, a smoke stinger, filled with concentrated sulfur and dried hemlock. I dropped it. The sphere hit the center of the dance floor and shattered. A thick violet mist erupted, swirling through the legs of the dancers. At the same moment, 40 other spheres dropped from the shadows of the servant quarters. The music died. The laughter turned to confused murmurs, then to screams. "Guards!" Jace shouted, standing up and knocking over his wine. "What is this? Clear the mist!" But the guards weren't coming. In the barracks, the doors had been barred from the outside with heavy iron rods. In the armory, the bowstrings had been cut. And in the plaza, the servants were no longer carrying trays. They were drawing serrated blades from beneath their aprons. I stood up on the rafter, the wind whipping my mud-stained cloak. I didn't hide anymore. I stepped onto the edge of the marble ledge, looking down at my father. The mist began to clear, leaving a circle of empty space directly below me. Silas looked up. His eyes traveled from my boots to my scarred chest, to the silver-white X on my throat. The color drained from his face. The great Alpha stumbled back, his hand clawing at his throat as if he could feel the brand burning his own skin. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking over the silence of the plaza. "You're dead. The ravine took you." I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. I simply raised my hand and made a fist. From every shadow, every doorway, and every alley, the quiet death stepped into the light. 40 wolves, scarred and silent, their eyes fixed on the throne. The festival of lies was over. The revolution had begun. And for the first time in 10 years, my father realized that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a wolf that roars. It's the one that has forgotten how to beg. Chapter 5. The great hall was a kaleidoscope of violence. The violet mist still clung to the rafters, turning the torchlight into a ghostly bruised purple. My quiet death moved like a single organism, a tide of gray and black fur drowning the golden-clad sun guards. There were no battle cries, only the rhythmic thump of bodies and the metallic singing of blades. I leaped from the balcony, my cloak snapping behind me like wings. I landed in the center of the royal dais, the marble cracking under my boots. "Stay back!" Jace shrieked. He had scrambled behind the high-backed throne, his face pale and slick with sweat. He clutched a rapier forged of pure silver, the pommel encrusted with sapphires that caught the light. "Guards! Protect your prince! Kill this mute abomination!" But his guards were busy dying. I walked toward him, my steps heavy and deliberate. I didn't draw my obsidian dagger yet. I wanted him to feel the weight of every second he had spent sleeping in silk while I slept in the mud. "You're supposed to be a pile of bones, Kaelen," Jace yelled, his voice cracking with a high-pitched terror. "Father said you were gone. He said the mountain ate you. You think you can just walk back in here and take what's mine? I am the Alpha heir. I have the voice. I have the blood." He lunged. It was a classic school-taught thrust, perfect form, zero soul. I didn't even shift. I stepped inside his guard, my hand snapping out like a viper to catch his wrist. I twisted. The sound of his radius snapping was the only speech I needed. Jace let out a shrill scream, dropping the sapphire rapier. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his broken arm, his chest heaving. "Please," he sobbed, the golden sun reduced to a puddle of silk and tears. "I didn't want to do it. Father forced me to watch. I was just a kid, Kaelen. I'll give you anything. Take the treasury. Take the north. Just don't kill me. I looked down at him. This was the man who was supposed to lead our people. A man who begged the moment the wind changed. Through our bond, I felt Alara watching from the edge of the dais, her hand on her own blade, her eyes cold with judgment. She saw the same thing I did, a hollow shell in a golden suit. I reached down and grabbed Jace by his throat, the throat that had never felt the bite of iron. I lifted him off the ground until his feet kicked uselessly at the air. I leaned in, my scarred X inches from his face. I didn't growl. I let the primal hum vibrate through my hand and into his larynx. It was a frequency of pure, unadulterated grief. I let him feel the 3 years of winter. I let him feel the silence of the dead drop. Jace's eyes rolled back. He wasn't just terrified, he was being overwhelmed by a history he had tried to forget. I didn't kill him. Death was too quick for a man who loved his own voice so much. I threw him across the dais like a sack of unwanted grain. He hit the base of the throne and slumped over, unconscious and broken. I looked at the crowd of nobles who had stopped fighting to watch. I pointed at my brother, then I pointed at the floor. I didn't need a tongue to hear their answer. It was the sound of 100 swords hitting the marble floor, as they realized the golden era was dead. But the real monster was still sitting in the shadows. I turned my gaze to the back of the hall, where the heavy oak doors to the inner sanctum were slamming shut. My father was retreating. He was heading for the one place he thought he was safe. I reached back and drew my obsidian blade. It felt warm in my hand, eager for the finish. The prince was done. Now it was time to talk to the Alpha. The inner sanctum smelled of old parchment, cold stone, and the sour metallic tang of cowardice. The heavy iron-reinforced doors didn't stand a chance. I didn't use a key. I used the raw kinetic fury of the primal hum. I slammed my shoulder into the oak, and the hinges shrieked, snapping like dry twigs. I stepped into the vault, the place where Silas kept the ledgers of the souls he'd sold. He was there, backed against a wall of silver bullion, his hand clutching a ceremonial dagger that shook in his grip. He looked pathetic. The great Alpha of the Silverstone was just a frightened old man in a room full of shiny rocks. "Get back," he hissed, his voice thin and reedy. "I made you, Kaelen. I gave you that strength. Everything you are is because I spared you that day at the stone." I didn't stop. I walked toward him, my boots crunching on the gold coins scattered on the floor. I didn't draw my blade yet. I wanted him to see my hands. The hands that had climbed the jagged cliffs of the dead drop. The hands that had buried the brothers he'd sent to kill me. "I can give you more." Silas scrambled sideways, his eyes darting toward a hidden floor safe. "The Southern Pax, they'll listen to me. I'll tell them it was all a mistake. I'll name you the sovereign. We can rule together, father and son." I stopped 3 feet from him. The air in the vault began to vibrate. It wasn't the wind, it was the frequency of my rage, a low-octave roar that made the silver bars on the shelves rattle. I reached up and slowly untied the leather cord at my neck, letting my cloak fall to the floor. I stood before him, shirtless, a map of 3 years of survival. My ribs were visible, my muscles corded like steel cables, and centered on my throat was the X. Silas stared at it. His breathing became shallow. I had to. The pack needed the silver. We were starving, Kaelen. I did it for them. I didn't need to speak to call him a liar. I reached out and grabbed the ceremonial dagger from his hand as if it were a toy. I snapped the blade in half with my thumb and dropped the pieces at his feet. Clink, clink. I stepped into his personal space, my chest pressing against his. I leaned down, my lips an inch from his ear. I didn't whisper. I opened my mouth and let out the true hum, the unfiltered, agonizing sound of the branding iron. Silas screamed. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his ears as the vibration shattered his composure. It wasn't just a sound. It was the physical sensation of the heat he'd used on me. For 3 years, I had carried that fire in my throat. Now, I was giving it back. I grabbed him by the hair and forced him to look at the ledgers on his desk. the names of the Omegas he had sold. I pointed to the names. Then I pointed to the X on my throat. Then I pointed to the door where Alara and Coda stood watching, representing the thousands he had betrayed. Silas looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. "What do you want? Mercy? I'm your father." I didn't give him mercy. Mercy is for those who make mistakes. Silas made a choice. I reached for my obsidian blade. I didn't go for his throat. That would have been too poetic. I went for his heart. I drove the blade home with a single silent thrust. Silas's eyes went wide. He gasped, his hands clutching my forearms, his lifeblood spilling over my knuckles. It was warm as the silver he loved so much. I held him as he slumped, my eyes locked on his until the light finally flickered out. I lowered his body to the cold stone floor. I didn't feel a surge of joy. I didn't feel a rush of power. I felt a weight lift, a 3-year-old silence that had finally found its period. I turned and walked toward the door. Alara stepped forward, her hand finding mine. She didn't say a word. She just squeezed my hand, her eyes telling me that the ghost was finally gone. I looked back at the vault, the room full of gold and blood. The Alpha was dead. The king was gone. And for the first time in my life, the silence didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a clean slate. Chapter 6. The smoke from the festival fire still hung over the city, but the screaming had stopped. The Silverstone was quiet, not the terrified silence of a conquered people, but the breathless hush of a pack waiting to see if their new master was a savior or a different kind of monster. I stood on the high balcony, the wind pulling at my dark hair. I didn't wear Silas's gold-stitched robes. I wore my scarred skin and the obsidian blade at my hip. Suddenly, the horizon ignited. A golden army 500 strong crested the eastern ridge. The Sunclaw pack. They moved with a terrifying synchronized beauty, their gilded armor reflecting the rising sun like 1,000 mirrors. At their head was Alpha Jackson, a man whose reputation for divine justice was usually just a polite way of saying he took whatever he wanted in the name of the moon goddess. They stopped at the great gates. Jackson didn't shift. He stayed on his white stallion, his voice magically projected to shake the very stones of the palace. "Citizens of the Silverstone," Jackson roared. "Your Alpha has fallen, your prince is a coward. Under the Accords of the 5 Peaks, I declare this territory lawless. To prevent further bloodshed by these quiet savages, I, Alpha Jackson, claim the Silverstone as a ward of the Sunclaw. Open your gates and submit to the light." I looked down at the courtyard. My quiet death were already there, melting into the shadows of the battlements. They didn't growl, they didn't shout, they just waited for the click. I stepped onto the edge of the balcony, clearly visible against the morning sky. Jackson looked up, his golden eyes squinting. "So, the rumors are true. The mute prince has crawled out of his hole. Tell me, Kaelen, or whatever you call yourself now, how do you intend to lead a pack you cannot command? How do you bargain for peace when you have no tongue?" He laughed, a rich, arrogant sound that made his soldiers join in. I didn't reach for a megaphone. I didn't send a messenger. I closed my eyes and reached deep into the marrow of my bones, tapping into the primal hum. I didn't just vibrate my chest. I used the stone of the palace itself as an amplifier. I sent a shockwave of frequency through the foundation, a low-octave rumble that made the stallion beneath Jackson rear up in terror. The laughter stopped. The ground beneath the Sunclaw army began to tremble. I jumped. I didn't use the stairs. I dropped 60 feet, shifting midair. I didn't become a golden wolf like my brother or a noble wolf like Jackson. I became something else, a massive, shadow-furred beast with silver eyes and a jagged white scar running through the fur of my throat. I landed in the dirt 10 feet from Jackson's horse. The impact sent a cloud of dust billowing outward. I stood up on 4 legs, my shoulders reaching the height of his saddle. I didn't snarl. I just looked him in the eye and projected a single crushing thought through the Alpha link. Leave or bleed. The mental weight of it was so heavy that Jackson's horse buckled to its knees. Jackson scrambled off, his hand flying to his golden claymore, his face pale. He realized in that moment that he wasn't facing a broken wolf. He was facing a wolf that had learned to speak the language of the earth itself. You're an abomination, Jackson whispered, his bravado crumbling. A king must have a voice. He must lead with words. I shifted back to my human form, standing naked and unashamed in the dust. I walked right up to him, my chest inches from his sword. I took the tip of his blade and pressed it against the X on my throat. I didn't need words. My eyes told him the truth. The man who gave me this scar is dead. The man who tried to take my mate is broken. What makes you think your gold can survive my silence? Around us, the ghost pack appeared on the walls, hundreds of them, their bows notched with black iron arrows. They didn't make a sound. The silence was so absolute it was deafening. Jackson looked at the walls. He looked at my eyes. He realized that for every word he could shout, I had 1,000 wolves who would kill without a whisper. He didn't draw his sword. He slowly sheathed it. The territory is not lawless, Jackson muttered, his voice barely audible. It has a king. He turned his horse around and signaled the retreat. The Golden Army faded back into the hills, leaving the Silverstone to the shadows. I turned back to my people. They were coming out of their homes now, the Omegas, the Elders, the Scraps. They looked at me, waiting for the traditional alpha howl to claim the territory. I didn't howl. I simply raised my hand and pointed to the sun. The night is over. And for the first time, the Silverstone pack didn't cheer. They simply bowed, a wave of silent loyalty that was louder than any roar. The high throne of the Silverstone was gone. I had ordered the gold-leafed, velvet-cushioned seat of my father smashed into rubble and thrown into the ravine. In its place stood a slab of raw black basalt, cold, unyielding, and honest. I sat upon it now, my hands resting on my knees. I didn't wear a crown. I wore the leather bracers of a hunter and the silver X on my throat like a medal of honor. Beside me, Ilara stood. She wore a gown of midnight blue, but beneath the silk I knew she carried her bone daggers. She wasn't my ornament. She was my bridge. Through our bond, she felt the pulse of the room, translating the primal hum of my soul into the new laws of the land. The great hall was packed, but you could hear a pin drop. The high houses, the ones who had cheered while Silas sold their neighbors, stood in the back, trembling. In the front, where the nobles once sat, were the Omegas, the scarred, and the survivors of the dead drop. I closed my eyes and let the vibration start in my chest. It rippled outward, a low grounding frequency that settled the nerves of every wolf in the room. I am not your master, the hum projected. I am your shield. Ilara stepped forward, her voice clear and resonant, echoing the thoughts I sent through the bond. The law of the voice is dead, Ilara announced, her eyes sweeping the room. From this day forward, the Silverstone pack shall be known as the Pack of the Unspoken. We will no longer judge a wolf by the strength of their howl or the purity of their lineage. She paused, looking at a young Omega girl in the front row, a girl whose tongue had been notched for disrespect under the old regime. The new law is this, Ilara continued. The strength of the pack is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable. The grain will go to the hungry before it goes to the high tables. The healers will tend to the scarred before they tend to the pure. And any alpha who seeks to sell the blood of his people for silver will meet the king's blade in the silence of the night. A collective gasp went through the room. The high houses looked at each other, realizing their hoarded wealth was about to become the pack's foundation. I stood up. I didn't need to shout to command their attention. I walked down the steps of the dais, stopping in front of the Omega girl. I reached into my pouch and pulled out a small silver coin, the last one I had taken from Silas's vault. I didn't give it to her as money. I crushed it in my bare hand, the metal groaning and flattening until it was a useless, twisted piece of scrap. I dropped it at her feet. Silver is nothing. Life is everything. The girl looked up at me, her eyes filling with tears. She didn't bow out of fear. She pressed her forehead against my hand in a gesture of absolute trust. I looked back at the ghost pack, at Coda, Mina, and the 40 others who had crawled out of the mud with me. They were no longer the quiet death. They were the silent guard. They were the proof that a wolf without a voice is the most dangerous hunter in the woods, because he never wastes his breath on a lie. I returned to the basalt throne and took Ilara's hand. The bond between us was a living thing now, a golden thread that laced the entire pack together. I could feel their heartbeats, hundreds of them syncing with my own. I looked out over my kingdom. It wasn't the empire Silas had dreamed of. It was something better. It was a refuge. The Sunclaw might have the gold. The northern packs might have the songs. But we had the truth. I leaned back against the cold stone. My throat didn't ache anymore. The silence wasn't a weight. It was a weapon. And as the moon rose over the Silverstone, bathing the valley in a pale, protective light, I knew one thing for certain. They tried to silence a prince. They ended up creating a king, The epilogue. 10 years have passed since the golden era was buried in the mud of the Silverstone. I stand on the battlements of the High Watch, looking out over a valley that has forgotten the taste of fear. Below me, the city of Ethelgard, the city of the unspoken, thrives. It is not a city of marble and gold, but of granite and heart. The markets are full, not with the trade of slaves, but with the harvest of a free people. I see a group of pups playing in the square. Some are high-born, some are the children of the discarded. They don't know the difference. They only know that when they fall, a dozen hands reach out to catch them. My hair is streaked with gray now, and the scars on my chest have faded into silver maps of a war that feels like a lifetime ago. But the X on my throat remains as sharp and clear as the day Silas branded me. It is no longer a mark of shame. It is the seal of the king. Beside me, Ilara leans against the parapet. She is more beautiful now than the day I pulled her from the silver cage. The mate bond doesn't just hum anymore, it sings. We don't need to speak to know each other's thoughts. I feel her pride in the way she looks at the schoolhouses, and I feel her peace in the way she leans her head against my shoulder. Coda is the general of the Sovereign Guard. He doesn't train soldiers, he trains protectors. He teaches the young wolves that a blade is only as sharp as the justice behind it. And Mina, she has built a sanctuary in the dead drop, turning the place of our execution into a lush garden of medicinal herbs and training grounds for the blind and the broken. The neighboring packs, the ones who once laughed at the mute prince, now send their emissaries to our gates, begging for our counsel. They realized that a pack that doesn't waste its breath on politics is a pack that always has its eyes on the truth. I reach into my tunic and pull out the shard of the sapphire rapier I took from my brother Jace. I kept it as a reminder of how easily nobility shatters. Jace lives in a quiet cottage in the southern orchards now. He has his voice, but he has no audience. He found that words are hollow when no one trusts the heart they come from. I look out at the horizon where the sun is beginning to set, casting long, peaceful shadows over the mountains. To those who are currently sitting in their own dead drop, to those who have been told their voice doesn't matter, to those who have been silenced by the ones who were supposed to protect them, listen to the silence. They think that by taking your voice, they are taking your power. They don't realize they are stripping away the noise so you can finally hear your own strength. They are giving you the ability to observe, to learn, and to strike when they least expect it. My father tried to bury the truth. Instead, he planted the seeds of a revolution. He tried to make me a ghost, and I became a king. Your scars are not your weakness. They are your armor. Your silence is not your cage. It is your weapon. The world might try to steal your voice, but they can never steal your soul. And one day, your actions will be so loud that the world will have no choice but to listen. I am Kaelen, the Silent King, and my story is just beginning.